From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us to close our 2015 Hispanic Heritage Month celebration. On behalf of the Library of Congress Hispanic Division, the LC Hispanic Cultural Society, and the Florida House, we are excited to have you here today. My name is Leah Apodaca-Kerwin. I'm the historian for the library's Hispanic Cultural Society. And I just wanted to share a personal note that today's lecture commemorates a city that's very fond and dear to my heart, St. Augustine. I'm not just a Florida girl born and raised and having grown up there, but my family ancestry traces back 14 generations to the first Spanish settlement period. So I'm very excited about this program today, and I hope Dr. Michael Francis, our guest speaker, teaches me a little bit about my family history. So before we move on, I just want to make a little note that you'll see some surveys in your chairs. If you have a moment, we'd appreciate you completing those so we can learn a bit about how you learned about the program today. So thank you for joining us, and here to welcome you is Acting Librarian of Congress, David Mao.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Leah, for that wonderful introduction. I didn't realize that you were from St. Augustine. At first, I thought you were going to say that something about being 14 generations, but I thought, no, that can't possibly be the case. So thank you. Welcome to the Library of Congress. Welcome to this program. It's my pleasure, of course, to welcome all of you on behalf of the library, the library's Hispanic Division, the library's Hispanic Cultural Society, the Florida House. We're here to close out the Hispanic Heritage Month celebration at the library, and I really think that there's no better place to do this than at the Library of Congress in general, celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month, because we have such fabulous collections here at the library on this particular topic. They span the earliest arrivals in the 15th century to the present, and we can trace the history of Hispanic Americans through these collections here at the Library of Congress, whether they be from maps, our manuscripts, our prints and photographs, motion pictures that we have, film strips, and of course books, because we do have a few of those here at the library. So this year, as part of our celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, the Library of Congress launched an online selection of recordings from its archives of Hispanic literature on tape. It's a series of a series of audio recordings of poets and prose writers reading from their work in their native languages. It's an archive that began here at the library in 1943 and contains nearly 700 recordings of poets and prose writers. They include writers, artists, I should say, from all over this part of the world, from the Iberian Peninsula, Latin America, the Caribbean, and of course the United States. These recordings are captured on magnetic tape reel, and until now you had to come here to the library to access them, but we've been working on a project to digitize the archive and present it online, and so that hopefully will greatly broaden access to this important material to not only the folks here in the world, in the United States, but across the world. A couple of other things I thought I'd mention to you. You may know that the Library of Congress, or the Librarian of Congress, has the opportunity to name a poet laureate, consultant in poetry, every year. And this year, we have Juan Felipe Herrera, who is the first Hispanic American to hold that position. And he, in fact, had his first reading to open up our celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month here at the library. So we have quite a bit of opportunity here at the Library of Congress, and I think this lecture from Professor Francis will just help to showcase one little spotlight, or showcase one little piece of the great history of Hispanics here in the United States. and also whet your appetite to perhaps, for those of you who are not necessarily library employees, or maybe those of you who are library employees and may not know very much about our collections in this particular area, will whet your appetite to do more investigation, make use of our resources here, and then pass that information along to others. So today we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Michael Francis, who is a history professor at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg. He is one of the nation's leading experts on the Spanish colonial experience in Florida. In 2011, Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar appointed Michael to serve on the St. Augustine 450th Commemoration Commission, and as part of the city's commemorative efforts, he authored a limited edition 450th anniversary commemorative book, St. Augustine, America's First Story, a story of unbroken history and enduring spirit. He's also no stranger to the library. Some of you may know that he was here at the library as a J. Kislak Fellow. I'm not quite sure when. 2010. Thank you very much. 2010, 2011. And he was able to make use of the library's resources here to conduct research and work on his book. And so thank you for coming back to the Library of Congress today to give this presentation. He has his doctorate in history from Cambridge. Between 1997 and 2012, he taught at the University of North Florida, and he's also served briefly as the chair of the Department of History at that institution. Then in April of 2012, he moved to the University of South Florida, so from north to south, and his teaching fields include colonial Latin America, early Florida, the Spanish borderlands, the pre-Columbian Americas, and Spanish paleography. That's quite a bit of stuff. How do you find time to do all of this? And so with all of that, I really do appreciate the fact that you did take the time to come up and talk to us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Francis. Thank you.
Wow, what a privilege to be back at the Library of Congress, and thanks so much for the kind invitation. I'm just going to make sure all the technology works. If at any point you cannot hear me at the back, yell or throw something, and I'll try. If I move my face away from the microphone, I can project pretty well, so if I move away from it, I hope you can still hear me all right. It's such a delight, really, to be back here. The last time I was here, I spoke about a murder mystery in the late 16th century in which 5 Franciscan friars were murdered. Today's talk, I hope, will be somewhat more uplifting than the murder of 5 friars. But I'd like to thank the Library of Congress for hosting this talk. And of course, Leah, who helped to bring me here, and Florida House, which, if you haven't been, please go and have some freshly squeezed orange juice. We try to do that every time I come to Florida. And of course, the Florida Humanities Council also made this possible, and my brilliant wife, Annie, who makes sure I don't say silly things, and I try my best. This has been a fascinating time to work on the history of early colonial Florida, in part because of all of these commemorations. In 2013, it was the 500-year commemoration of something related to Juan Ponce de Leon. And then this year, on September the 8th, the city of St. Augustine commemorated its 450th foundation, the date of its founding. How many of you have been to St. Augustine? Oh, wow, okay, that's unusual. When I leave Florida, the numbers are usually a lot smaller than that. Well, this is that particular day. You see on the gazebo in the main plaza the large birthday cake. I guess you need a birthday cake if you're having an anniversary, and if it's 450th, you need a large cake. And they did that in the city for the 450th. They did a reenactment, which they do every year, of the landing. I've been attending this almost every year since I moved to St. Augustine. This was really the first year they had active protesters, because anniversaries do something else. They bring out lots of people who otherwise really wouldn't care, couldn't care less that there's an anniversary approaching. And so the 450th, there were a number of protesters trying to disrupt the landing, the activity of the landing that day on September the 8th of 1565. This very disgruntled kayaker was splashing water on a fictional Pedro Menendez de Avilés, the founder of St. Augustine, as they moved their chalupa closer to town. And then, of course, 10 days later, their Royal Majesties came to St. Augustine, also as part of this broader commemoration of St. Augustine's 450th. Now, anniversaries really are rather curious episodes for historians, and many historians tend to shy away from commemorations. And when I was first asked to be involved in the 450th, I did so with some trepidation. This is an excerpt from a wonderful book by Michel Rolfe-Trouillot called Silencing the Past. And Michel Rolfe-Trouillot wrote about commemorations that they tend to sanitize the messy history lived by the actors. They also contribute to the continuous myth-making process, and in a sense, they create a past that is more elementary. In other words, when you think of how does one commemorate the 500 or the 450th, often what happens is that entire history is reduced to some very simple sound bites. Some things that you say, this is what we're commemorating, this is what we're celebrating. And I spent a lot of time asking people, what exactly are we commemorating? An actual landing, the legacy of that landing, specific individuals? Are we commemorating the founder of St. Augustine? What exactly is it that we're commemorating? Now, I think all of us do this to some extent, and I think anytime you write a book, you're faced with these problems of reducing something that is extraordinarily complex into something that is somewhat more elementary, somewhat more accessible. And I'm certainly guilty of it. Boy, I hate this title. I shouldn't say that, actually. This is the St. Augustine commemorative book, St. Augustine, America's First City. St. Augustine is not America's first city, and it's not even close to being America's first city. If you want to be technical, St. Augustine is the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the continental United States. Now, the press really hated that title. They said it would have to be so small on the page. We cannot call it that. We like First City, and they sell the T-shirts in St. Augustine First City, and the T-shirt would wrap around 4 times if we called it by that particular title. So it's not the first city. It's not the oldest, and most often when we have oldest and we have first, they're not. And we need to use those terms with a great deal of caution. I love what Tony Horowitz wrote about St. Augustine. This is how Tony Horowitz describes St. Augustine around the time of Jamestown, that it was a precarious outpost. I love this term, outpost. It was a precarious outpost beset by mutinies, pirate raids, plague, fires, Indian hostility, and other woes. This is what I wanted to call the book. And the only thing that they liked about this was pirate raids. They said, oh, you can use the pirates, because if you've been to St. Augustine, you realize that pirates are ubiquitous. And you almost get the sense that every weekend pirates came to town. It's weekend, there'll be pirates here again, and there's Talk Like a Pirate Day, there's the Pirate Museum, there's Dress Like a Pirate, pirates are everywhere. How many times in the 16th century was St. Augustine attacked by pirates? Once. One time. In the 17th century, we can count that on one hand, the number of direct pirate assaults. Now, leaving St. Augustine, that was a different story. If you were in a ship in the Florida Straits, in the Bahama Channel, in the Caribbean, that was a very different tale. But St. Augustine is not a place where pirates showed up every weekend for a celebration. And yet we have this sense that it was this place. Plague as well. There are very few instances of plague in the documentary evidence for St. Augustine from the 16th and early 17th century. And in fact, I've yet to find a single record that refers to pandemics in 16th century St. Augustine, Northeast Florida. Indian hostilities, certainly there's some. And after Francis Drake, the one lone pirate attack, certainly the local indigenous population looted much of the city. But there are very few Indian assaults on St. Augustine in the entire colonial period. So is any of this right? a precarious outpost. And this one is also quite fascinating, and one that certainly, I think, captures the popular view of St. Augustine in the colonial era, a place nobody wanted to be. You know, it was hot, there were mosquitoes, and when it wasn't hot, it was raining. And when it wasn't raining, there were hurricanes. And when there weren't hurricanes, there were nor'easters and floods. It sounded like a miserable place. Yet every governor in the 16th century asks for an extension. Why? And this is what intrigued me so much about the city. And the other thing that encouraged me to write about St. Augustine is because St. Augustine is very much an organic city. People have always lived in St. Augustine from the time it was founded. And its entire history has changed over time. And the way people remember its history and the way they celebrate its history and what they talk about. And so I'd like to just go back a little bit and talk about some of the early days in St. Augustine and how and why St. Augustine becomes that place that is the lone European settlement founded in the 16th century that actually survived in Florida. Because the Spanish crown wanted permanent presence in Florida from the beginning of the 16th century. And for 5 decades, there were expeditions after expeditions after expeditions. Now, none of these expeditions really left a legacy of a permanent settlement that survived. And so we have Ponce de Leon arriving for the first time in 13 and again in 21. We often give him credit for, so you see this term often, discovering Florida. It must have been a curious moment when he met the local perhaps Ais population, or for lack of a better term, Timucua, farther north, that they looked at him when he set foot ashore and said, "Thank you. Thank you for discovering us, Juan Ponce. We've been waiting for this moment since that goofy land bridge flooded, and you've done it." And of course, he didn't think of it in those terms. And there are reasons why Europeans use those terms, historical reasons, in the 16th century. And then, of course, in 1526, Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón established really what was the first Spanish settlement in what the Spanish referred to as Las Provincias de la Florida, which of course extended, for them, Las Provincias de la Florida extended from the Tortugas all the way up to the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. So we are standing in what was one of the early provinces of Florida. Congratulations, you're all early Floridians in that sense. And then, of course, Pánfilo de Narváez's expedition in 1527-28, Hernando de Soto. That expedition, again, extended to 1543. Father Luis Cáncer is a fascinating character. He was a Dominican friar, a close associate of Fray Bartolomé de las Casas. And Cáncer wanted to establish a utopian community in Florida. And he landed on the shores somewhere not far from present-day Tampa Bay and was very quickly clubbed over the head by Tocobaga Indians, and that ended the Dominican utopian experiment, and the Dominicans turned to Mexico. They didn't come back to Florida. And Tristan de Luna established a settlement in Pensacola, which lasted a couple of years, tried to establish a land route that connected Pensacola to a place the Spanish called Santa Elena, which we know today as Parris Island, South Carolina. And watch the news over the next year as Santa Elena approaches its 450th next year. There's a group of, there are individuals in Santa Elena who really want to establish a permanent research and interpretive center that tells the early history of Spanish presence in the continental United States. Well, Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, the heir to the next named governor of Florida, decided that when he was granted the license to be governor, he decided, I don't think I'm going. He looked at the history, this 5-decade history of miserable failures, and he said, no. I'm not going to Florida. And yet we get to this place with Pedro Menendez Avilés. Why on earth would he come to Florida? What would inspire him to go? And why would anybody join him on this expedition? But in talking about the history of St. Augustine, I think it is important to go back to the earliest recorded expedition, what Ponce really does, what was commemorated in 2013, is Ponce named the place. Ponce gave the name La Florida. That's where the name comes from, after Ponce's expedition. And Juan Ponce de Leon has maintained a rather privileged space in St. Augustine. He is a kind of privileged figure in the history of St. Augustine, even though he probably never set foot in what is present-day St. Augustine. And there are streets named after him, and there are businesses, and of course, some other, you got a statue. You know if they build a statue, it has to be true. So the statue, of course, dates to the early 1920s, and this statue is in one of the most privileged locations in the entire city, in the main plaza. Not Pedro Menendez de Avilés' statue, but rather Juan Ponce de Leon's statue. And of course, a lot of that dates back to St. Augustine, as I was saying, is this remarkable organic city that in many ways, as you walk the streets of St. Augustine is, yes, it is a Spanish colonial settlement, but at the same time, in many ways, it is an imagined community, kind of reframed and recreated in the vision of late Gilded Age Americans, in particular, Henry Flagler. And the shadow of Flagler's Florida really, I think, casts a profound shadow over St. Augustine's earlier history, because Flagler, of course, and many others thought about St. Augustine when Flagler built his absolutely magisterial hotel, the Ponce, as they call it, the Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine. He was trying to imagine a Spanish colonial settlement. What were these places like? Let's make St. Augustine look like that, because New Yorkers will love this. When the weather gets cold in New York, they'll come down and they want to see something that looks like a Spanish community. And so he did this. He changed street names from English street names to Spanish street names. He built buildings in this style to make them look like Spanish buildings. And Juan Ponce de Leon is very much woven into this Gilded Age narrative of St. Augustine. This is a wonderful painting, which I love, Lucas Cranach, the Elder's painting, 16th century painting of the Fountain of Youth. It's a wonderful painting of the elderly and infirm, and then, of course, they're all young women. Well, they're elderly women at first, and then they transform into young maidens, and then they go into this tent and get dressed and have a nice banquet. And it's a wonderful painting of this ubiquitous myth, this powerful myth that in many ways is rooted in myth. There is not a single document from Ponce's life, not one, not a single reference from his contracts, nothing that he's left us that makes reference to searching for the Fountain of Youth. He never writes it. He's never searching for the Fountain of Youth. He's disgruntled because he's been removed rather unceremoniously as governor of Puerto Rico. And as compensation for that removal, he gets a new contract to move north to discover any undiscovered, and by undiscovered, what he means are islands that have not been claimed by other individual Spaniards through contracts with the crown. And so he sets out to find other undiscovered islands to the north, and of course, he names Florida. He then returns in 1521. He's injured in a skirmish, likely with the Calusa Indians in southwest Florida, and he dies when that wound festers just before he reaches Havana, or right when he reaches Havana. Well, in the 19th century, one of the most remarkable pieces of property in St. Augustine is the property now that you know as the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park. And it's an amazing place in so many ways. And at the end of the 19th century, very beginning of the 20th century, the woman who owned this property, Luella Day McConnell, it's a property that had a bunch of natural springs on it. And as she roamed her property one day, she imagined Ponce de Leon searching for his Fountain of Youth. This was something that had entered into the popular imagination many thanks to Washington Irving into the English language. Washington Irving was so wonderful for making up things. Like Columbus thought that everyone thought the world was flat, and Columbus. This is Washington Irving. And Washington Irving popularized a 16th century fountain of youth story that was told originally as it related to Ponce de Leon about 15 years after Ponce's death. And it was told by the most influential Spanish chronicler of the day, Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés. Great name. If you're a writer, you want to change your name to that, because then everybody will read your work because your name's so important. In any case, he didn't like Ponce very much, and Oviedo was quite fond of ridiculing people he did not like and celebrating people he thought were great heroes, and also inventing tales that readers would find entertaining about Amazon women and other mythical cities of gold and riches. And one of the stories he told, very briefly, was Juan Ponce de Leon was, for Oviedo, one of the most credulous, foolish individuals ever to be born. Someone foolish enough to believe a story so silly that he spent his money and his life ultimately on this foolish quest to find a fountain of youth. And he died doing it. Now, of course, Ponce's dead, so there's no rebuttal to this. And the story was repeated again and again and again. And we all know that if you repeat a story enough, it can transform from myth into history. It became true. And since then, Juan Ponce de Leon has been inextricably connected to a story that he never once even referenced, and was not part of his original motivation. But in any case, in the beginning of the 20th century, Luella de McConnell saw one of these springs and thought, this is the Fountain of Youth. And she began to market this piece of property as the Fountain of Youth Park. And this was wonderful. All these Northeasterners coming to escape the winter. They need some entertainment. They come in, you get a glass of the water, you talk about the fountain, you see if it works, and then the park continues. The great irony in this entire story is that had she not done that, and had the next family, the Fraser family, who purchased the family after McConnell's death, had the Fraser family not preserved this piece of property, I promise you, this image that you're looking at now would be the site of million-dollar condominiums or homes. And we would have lost one of the most important archaeological sites in the country. Because no, it's not the Fountain of Youth. But what it is a site with more than 3,000 years of uninterrupted human occupation. And beside that, it is the site of the original St. Augustine. This is where Pedro Menendez Avilés landed in 1565, and this was the original encampment that lasted for less than a year, but this was the location of the original encampment. And here you see some of the outlines of some of the structures that archaeologists, particularly Kathleen Deegan from the University of Florida, have been working at this site for more than 4 decades, and archaeologists have been on this site from as early as early Smithsonian investigations in the 1930s. So what about this founder then of St. Augustine, Pedro Menendez Avilés, a rather enigmatic character, often reduced in the words of Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, how a complex past can be simplified. We often, and I certainly see this in textbooks, he was and the term that you most often see is conquistador. He was a conquistador. Well, what exactly does that mean? What was the difference between a conquistador and a settler? Were they different? Are we calling them the same thing? So I'll let you stew on that while we talk a little bit about Pedro Menendez Avilés, because going back to this 5-decade history of failure, this was a guy who was well connected with the Spanish crown. He was already quite wealthy. He'd been named commander of the Indies fleet in 1555. From some accounts, I've not tried to test this, but it's probably true. He likely crossed the Atlantic more than 50 times. Now, how many people have done that by plane, let alone in a ship? And one of his journeys was in a small chalupa. He made it from St. Augustine to the Canary Islands in 18 days. This guy was a marvelous navigator, sailor, inventor, had quite a rich background before Florida. And you look at this list, and he looks at it, and you think, died in Florida, died probably sank somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, was placed at the bottom of the Mississippi, died in Florida, failed expedition, chose not to even bother. And here's Menendez who says, this time it's going to be different. We can go to Disney, and the beaches are lovely, and come along with me. And you have to wonder, was this guy, if we did a reality show from the days, could he be, the 10 most foolish individuals from the 16th century? And here's the number one fool for thinking that something is going to come of this. Because do you think by this point he thinks he's going to find silver or gold or emeralds? No. They know there are not gold mines here, so it doesn't fall within that great triumvirate of motivations of God, glory, and gold, and he thinks he's going to find some gold mines that nobody else had managed to find. This is just a contemporary rendering of Pedro Menendez Avilés. So I wanted just to highlight some of his contract. I'll go through it really quickly because it does give us a window into what the Crown really wanted, because the Crown wanted permanence in Florida, but the Crown didn't want to pay for it. And so most of these contracts, when we go back to the 16th century, these are private contracts with private individuals who fund the expeditions. The Crown does not. The Crown doesn't want to pay for anything. And so the Crown wants permanence because Florida remains a strategic location. The French, of course, had launched an expedition there in 1562. There was a settlement on what is now Parris Island, South Carolina. It didn't last for very long before the French abandoned it. And then in 1564, they went back and founded what became known as Fort Caroline in what is the present-day Jacksonville, Florida. Well, the Spanish and Menendez did not know the French were at Fort Caroline when this contract was signed. So the contract was not to get the French out of Florida. That was not the purpose. And the Crown doesn't invest anything in the expedition until it learns that the French are there. And when it learns that, then it gives Menendez some more soldiers and some other supplies. But this is what he has to do. He has a month and a half to prepare 6 small ships, 10 really small vessels, and load them all with supplies and prepare them for warfare. He has to pay for this. He and the people who invest in it. So you think, okay, there's no gold or silver there. What are they doing? He has to take 500 men. 100 of them must be farmers, 100 sailors, and the rest men and officers of sea and war. At least 2 clerics. He brings 4, but at least 2. And men skilled in stone cutting, carpentry, farriers, blacksmiths, and surgeons. All will be armed. Of course, everybody's armed on these early expeditions, including the English expeditions. Everybody has a weapon. But of course, you get from this, the Crown wants permanence. The Crown wants 1/5 of these individuals to be farmers, and then, of course, the others to possess the skill set of people required for permanence. He has to prepare his galleon, the San Pelayo. He loved this ship so much. Another time, if I'm ever invited back, I'm going to tell you the story of the San Pelayo, because a few months after this episode, the San Pelayo sinks off the coast of Denmark. It's an amazing story. But that was his precious. This was one of the most spectacular galleons, or galleathas, in Europe at the time. This was a ship that, certainly according to people who've worked most closely with the ship itself, this is a ship that was almost 100 tons. The largest of the Jamestown ships, to give you an idea, was 120. This was a magnificent galleon. So he was to bring that, and he can load it with goods to trade in the Indies. Here you see the first clue of what this contract might be for Menendez. He can load it with stuff that he can sell elsewhere in the Indies as long as he leaves enough room to carry 300 men and supplies. And that again gives you a sense of the size of this vessel. He has to pay for all of these men, more than 1,000 of them. He has to pay for them for 1 entire year from the moment they board the ships. This looks like a horrible contract. But this is the only way he's going to get people to join him. Come to Florida, you don't pay for anything for a year. And then he has 3 years to do the following. Send 500 men, 200 of them must be married, because we all know married men stay put. And 200 of them must be married, 100 farmers, they must be religiously clean. In other words, the crown, they couldn't be of what the crown categorized as the prohibited ones. Moors, suspected Jews, Protestants, they all go on Menendez's expedition. Menendez was very clever at avoiding having to get anyone to get licenses to go to the Americas. He'd always say, gosh, I'd love to get the licenses for everyone, but wow, and the French are there, and the more French are coming. I can wait, but then you'll probably lose Florida, but that's your call. And the crown, okay, go. And he would be able to go, and it makes it frustrating for historians because we can't piece together who all these people are. But through other documents, we know that on all of these expeditions, there are Africans, there are Moors, there are conversos, there are people who probably shouldn't have been there or would not have received license. Plus, it was a very mixed group. At least 30% of his fleet was probably made up of people who were not Spanish. Portuguese, Flemish, German, Irish, English, Italian, North African, Greece, other parts of the Mediterranean. These are the people who found St. Augustine. To call it Spanish Florida is really a misnomer in many ways. He has to build or populate 2 or 3 towns, take at least 10 or 12 friars. At no time in the 16th century are there 12 friars in Florida. This myth that, everywhere in the New World, when it starts to rain, it's only friars that come descending from the sky to watch and make sure that people are observing the faith. There's never one moment in 16th century Florida in which there are 12 friars. Never. That only happens in the beginning, really, in the 1630s and into the 1640s. At least 4 from the Society of Jesus, and of course he does bring Jesuits the next year, and the Jesuits establish a series of missions in the Gulf and around present-day Miami, and of course the mission farthest to the north that the Jesuits established was a place called Jacan, which we know today as Chesapeake Bay. There were Jesuit friars in Chesapeake Bay in 1570. This narrative that the Jamestown people arrive and this first magical moment of encounter is an English invention. There were probably still people alive who remembered the Jesuits, and they would likely remember the Jesuits because all those Jesuits were slaughtered. And so that story would not have been lost to the people who encounter the first Jamestown folks. They would have seen Europeans, and we would have seen many Europeans long before the Jamestown crew arrives. Horses and mares, calves, hogs, sheep, any other livestock. And then at the bottom you see, he shall attempt to place 500 slaves who will grow sugarcane. Here you begin to see what the crown anticipates is going to be the financial benefit of this colony that does not have gold or silver. Now, Menendez has different plans. He's not interested in sugarcane. He never brings anywhere close to 500 slaves. In fact, in the 16th century, the largest number of both slaves and enslaved blacks were probably somewhere between 30 and 50. Now, you might not think that that's much, but in terms of percentage of the population, it was quite high. To have 30 or 50, both free and enslaved. And that's the case with all these expeditions. He has to try to do this in a nice way, in friendship and Christianity. Now, this doesn't always work, but this is in his contract. And then in case of non-compliance, he has to leave a 15,000 ducat bond. This is a lot of money. A skilled surgeon at the time would make an annual salary, of about 96 ducats. So the crown's saying, you're going to leave a bond of 15,000 ducats. And if you get to the Caribbean and you decide you're not going to go to Florida, thank you very much, because the crown could use this extra cash. But you're going to comply with this contract. And so you think, when you look at these terms, you think, well, really, he must be one of the most foolish characters to do this, and the cost of this. So we have to look and see, what does he get in return? Well, he gets 15,000 ducats cash. So he can use that to buy supplies and to pay some of the men early on. He gets a grant in 1565 that very few people get. In fact, the crown is not issuing these kinds of contracts any longer. He gets the right to issue repartimientos. He gets the right to issue land grants. The crown doesn't want that right granted to individuals. The crown wants that to be then taken over by crown-controlled institutions, not private individuals. But Menendez says, I have to get people to go. And the only way I can get people to go if you grant me the right to issue land grants. And it does. He gets 500 slave licenses. Now, what does he do with those licenses? Well, he certainly doesn't bring them to Florida. He trades them sells them under the table in the Caribbean. It's like giving him cash. This is a wonderful concession for resources. He gets the title of captain and governor general, an annual salary. But note that the crown says you get your 2,000 ducat annual salary, but you have to draw it from the fruits of the land. So in other words, the crown's not paying anything yet into this. You know, the 15 ducats is kind of a wash, but the crown's saying you don't get that. The title of adelantado literally means he who goes before others. There were about 70 people, Spaniards in the 16th century, who were conferred this particular title. It was a prestigious title. It does have an association with a military rank, but it was a title that he was granted in perpetuity. So there is an adelantado of Florida who has a palace in Gijón and a residence in Madrid. He gets that in perpetuity. The next point doesn't really matter because it doesn't happen, but he gets about 110,000 acres of land for him to choose. Anywhere in Florida from the Tortugas to the Chesapeake, basically. 110,000 acres. 1/15 shares in all royal profits in perpetuity, 2 fisheries in perpetuity. So if I were his heir, I'd be going straight to Disney and saying, well, I get my 1/15 share of land in perpetuity. Settlers pay fewer taxes. He gets concessions on taxes. He gets political power when he leaves. He's free from having to pay duty on goods bound for Florida. It's not surprising that most of the local merchants in Seville despised this guy. They really did, because he could undercut a lot of this trade. He then can take, and here we see the crux of what Menendez really thinks this Florida enterprise is going to be for him. In the first 6 years, he can sail 2 galleons, or he can lease them to other individuals, and 2 pataches to any part of the Indies. So this includes Peru, Mexico, Cuba, Rio de la Plata. He can send them anywhere in the Indies, load them with food and drink only. How carefully do you think they followed that policy? If you can only put food and drink on your ship, no problem. It's only food and drink. Sure, all kinds of other goods get in there. And then on return, he doesn't have to pay tax on that merchandise that he brings back. And then in those same 6 years, he can send ships, 10 different ships to the Caribbean. So what Menendez is thinking is he's going to create a commercial empire in the Caribbean, the Gulf, and in the continental United States. These are the kinds of professions of people he brings with him. These are the people we call the conquistadors. Stonecutters and bricklayers and carpenters and tailors, sheep shearers and blacksmiths and rope makers and locksmiths and surgeons, a hat maker, a trumpeter, 117 laborers. And then one day I'm going to find this guy. I don't know his name yet, but the bottom guy, I love this guy. Un maestre de hacer cerveza. A master beer brewer. You can't. Nobody's going to go on an expedition unless you have your master beer brewer with you on the expedition. If I were Budweiser, this is what I'd use as my commercial. This is a 500-ton galleon, a replica 500. Just to give you a sense, his was 996 tons. And so imagine these ships sailing off the coast of Florida. And these are the men that he brought with him because, of course, he learned that the French were there. This is just a replica of the San Pelayo. I'm going a little bit quickly because I'm running out of time. But the whole commercial enterprise was disrupted somewhat when Menendez and King Philip II learned that the French were there. And they learned that from the Spanish ambassador in Paris. This is not the actual letter that Frances de Alava sent back to the crown, but it's quite similar. And I love his correspondence because a lot of his correspondence is in code. So this is what's coming back from the court in Paris to Madrid. And so I'm working with one of my students now on code decipherment, which is great fun. And of course, when they learn that the French are there, the king issues him an order. And you know you have a good document when somebody writes secreto, secret, in the margin. Like that's going to keep it secret as you outline it and you write secret. In any case, it said, if anybody asks where you're going, tell them you're going to Rio de la Plata, the southern cone. And the French learn that he's going, and that whole story with the French and the Spanish is quite fascinating. He picks up a couple of, really 10 Englishmen on his way in Puerto Rico who also take part in this conquest expedition. And remember, in his contract, he was supposed to establish 2 or 3 towns. This is what he does in the first 3 years. What in the world is he thinking? 2 or 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And why is he in Tennessee and North Carolina? In other words, if you think about the crown's motivation to control this shipping lane as the Spanish fleet moves up here and then sails back, Menendez clearly is far less interested in controlling the shipping lane than he is in a commercial enterprise. And in particular, what he's interested in is a place in northern Mexico called Zacatecas. Why Zacatecas? Well, this is the site of the great silver mine, only found by the Europeans in the 1540s. And here's Menendez trying to control ports on the Gulf Coast, the Atlantic seaboard, to what he believes is going to be his principal port at Parris Island, South Carolina, not far from Hilton Head. Deepwater port, great for sailing galleons back to Europe, and then a series of garrisons inland that connect his enterprise to the silver mines of Mexico. And what if that silver no longer has to go overland down to Veracruz, across to Havana, up a very dangerous Bahama Channel and Florida Straits, and back to Spain? What if that silver can move overland? And what if you're the governor and adelantado in perpetuity, and you control a whole series of garrisons that then can feed that? This is his view of this enterprise. And yet, in the textbooks, we reduce him to conquistador. Is that what he is? Now, of course, what Menendez doesn't realize at this time is it's a long, long, long way to Zacatecas. The other thing he does not appreciate is that other people live there. And they were less enthusiastic about this enterprise than Menendez was about this enterprise. And of course, the soldiers that he stationed in these places were not excited about being isolated in these garrisons. So by the time we get to 1573, only St. Augustine and Santa Elena are left. Just in the few years. By the time we get to 1587, after Francis Drake's attack, the only one left is St. Augustine. And St. Augustine survives. And I guess we have to do part 2 next time when we move into the next set. So on that note, I think I'm over my time limit. I will tell you that he was frustrated by it, and he sent a letter to the crown asking the crown for permission to enslave all of the Indians who lived from Tampa Bay along the coast all the way up to Cape Canaveral. To get them out of there because they were disrupting his enterprise. The crown, not surprisingly, said no. And of course, he doesn't do that. So thank you so much. And to see that most of those of you who have not been to St. Augustine, I invite you. And I'm delighted to answer any questions you might have. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
So thank you so much, Dr. Francis. That was a wonderful talk. Before I give my closing remarks, we would like to hear from Maria Molina. She is the cultural attaché from the Embassy of Spain. She's going to say a few event remarks.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen, it would have been a pleasure to introduce your so fascinating and entertaining speech on behalf of the Spanish Embassy, but unfortunately I was late. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to close with some remarks on our collaboration with Dr. Michael Francis, a wonderful scholar on the Spanish presence in the United States. I would just like to add to what may have been said on your work, that his book has been given to Their Majesties, the King and Queen of Spain, during their visit to St. Augustine last 18th of September. I don't know if this was mentioned. And also to an array of guests from Spain who attended a business encounter between the US and Spain within the commemoration. So after the commemoration, it took place in St. Augustine. Well, we're culminating with the commemoration in St. Augustine, a cycle of commemorations which have celebrated our Spanish legacy. They started in 2013 with the participation of Michael in one of the projects I would like to mention. I don't know if it has been already alluded to, but I would like to thank him for that. It started in 2013 with the anniversary of the arrival to Florida by Ponce de Leon. And it went on by commemorating the discovery of the Pacific by Vasco Núñez de Balboa, and also the third centenary of the birth of Fray Junípero Serra now, Saint Junípero Serra. And it has culminated now with this commemoration. And I think this has given us a great opportunity to highlight our cultural legacy, exploring our common roots, our common past, our shared history, not only with the United States, but also with Latin America, of course. And as a last effort, I would like to inform you that our cultural program, Spain Arts and Culture, is bringing a final exhibition. Designing America is the title, Spain's imprint on the US, and we hope to host you, Michael, for that event also in a parallel activity to the exhibition. This exhibition will span from exploration to modern day. It will deal more on architecture, urban planning, and so on. And it's been organized in collaboration with our Biblioteca Nacional, so the National Library of Spain. Michael has collaborated with many Spanish institutions, and most of all with Acción Cultural Española, the Spanish cultural agency for promotion overseas and also within Spain. He was commissioned to curate the great project Imagining La Florida, and he has given you some hints on what he uncovered there, the myth of the fountain youth and so on. So I would like to express my gratitude for your collaboration. It's through your research that we're more aware of a common history, and I think this helps us bring us together, bring us closer, enrich our relationship. So thank you very much. Congratulations for your work. Okay.
Thank you so much, Ms. Molina. So what a wonderful way to end Hispanic Heritage Month here at the Library of Congress. On behalf of the Hispanic Division, the Office of Inclusivity and Compliance, and the Hispanic Cultural Society, we wanted to thank Dr. Francis by presenting him with this certificate. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice acceptance.
And yeah, absolutely. And it truly was such a great way to wrap things up for Hispanic Heritage Month 2015. It feels like ages ago, but just 30 days ago, we had our kickoff event with Juan Felipe Herrera, the poet laureate, who is the first Hispanic poet laureate that has been named by the Library of Congress. And throughout this month, we've had lectures, tours, concerts, gallery talks, and they've all showcased the rich history of Hispanics here in the United States. And they've all honored the theme for this year, which was honoring our heritage, building our future. So we've paid tributes to the generations of Hispanic Americans that have positively influenced and enriched this nation and society, many of which you had mentioned earlier today during your talk. And we did this here at the Library of Congress, and I don't know if many of you realize, but we have less than 80 employees here that work here that identify themselves as Hispanic or Latino. And so we were able to put together over 10 events this year to preserve this important history and to celebrate this beautiful culture history that we have. So we did want to thank a few different offices here at the library. We couldn't have done this without the help of collaborating with other offices within our institution. So we wanted to thank the American Folklife Center, the Office of Opportunity, Inclusiveness, and Compliance, and of course Georgette Dorn in the Hispanic Division. And we also have a wonderful team of board members for the Hispanic Cultural Society. So I first wanted to thank, and if you could all stand, I wanted to thank Carelis Rodriguez. She is our treasurer, and she is just fantastic. She has all sorts of roles here at the library. She's an event planner extraordinaire, accountant extraordinaire. Also, Roberto Salazar, Maria Perez, Rosabel Santos Flores, Leah Apodaca Kerwin, who was the one who introduced this wonderful topic to us today. And finally, the event planning factotum of the Library of Congress, Catalina Gomez. And all of these individuals have spent countless hours before work, after work, putting these events together, and definitely their passion for Hispanic culture shows. So with this, we conclude Hispanic Heritage Month here at the Library of Congress. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Dr. Francis. And if you would like to join me in the lobby, we will be having a small reception.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.